Daniel Mulino makes a welcome first appearance at the Sydney Institute. I will introduce him briefly. He spent time in state politics in Victoria in the upper house, but the federal member Fraser, near Tullamarine Airport, right? Yeah. So the federal member for Fraser, which was a new seat, I think started in 2019, who was elected as a member, it says here in May 2019. He completed a PhD in economics at Yale University in 2005, and he's here on the occasion of the launch of Safety Net, The Future of Welfare in Australia. And this book's got a foreword by Bill Kelty. Bill Kelty did the launch in Melbourne. The Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, is going to do a launch in Canberra. The most important launch, of course, is the Sydney launch in Sydney, at the Sydney Institute. And Daniel, you're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gerard, and thanks also to Anne and to Jacqueline and the Sydney Institute for giving me the opportunity to say a few words here today. And I feel pathetic as a Melburnian saying thanks to all those for braving the cold, but I feel like my body core temperature has fallen a lot just walking over from the Windsor. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging? And can I just start with the concept of risk? And just make the observation that between 2009 and 2012, Australian governments spent 50 times more cleaning up after natural disasters than they did on preparing for them. During this period, the Productivity Commission has observed federal, state and local governments spent around $11 billion on post-disaster recovery and just over $220 million on resilience and mitigation. As for COVID, the failure to prepare by Australian governments and international governments for the inevitable pandemic that was going to come at some point, in both human terms and economic terms, is astronomical. In 2005, 17 years ago, Michael Osterholm wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine of the need to prepare for the next pandemic. In my words, pandemics are white swan events, not black swan events, borrowing from Nassim Taleb. We know there are going to be more pandemics. In Osterholm's words, if we don't prepare, the loss of human life will be devastating and the cost of a world economy in shambles for several years can only be imagined. So 2005, very prescient words. The imbalance of what we spent in the lead up to COVID on preparation, on stockpiles, and what we had to spend afterwards. The federal government spent over $350 billion directly, state governments spent a great deal of money, and of course we had massive indirect costs, both in terms of the economic slowdown and the human cost. The imbalance between what we spent on preparation and what we had to spend during and after COVID, I believe, would be far greater than 50 to 1 were we to do a rigorous analysis. We clearly need to invest more in natural disasters and pandemics. But this raises for me what is an even more significant and challenging and difficult question, and I believe a much more important question, both for the quality of life of our citizens, but also for the federal government's bottom line. How can the welfare state be reformed so that it is better at managing risk for individuals? I would argue that risk management has always been central to the welfare state. In fact, the welfare state emerged in the late 19th century and early 20th century on many occasions as reforms of pre-existing insurance schemes. I believe that we now stand at a fork in the road with $1 trillion in debt following unprecedented levels of spending following COVID, with sustained low productivity growth and with sustained cost pressures right across our largest social insurance institutions. For context, I would say that welfare is the foundation of all of our lives. Everyone benefits from a strong welfare state, and this was exposed during COVID. All of us, whether rich or poor, relied on strong testing, on strong tracing, on strong public and private hospitals, on the development of vaccines, and on well-trained doctors, nurses, and allied health professionals. Countless lives were saved. But I believe a modern economy is also built on the welfare state. The sexy high-tech industries that often capture so much of our imagination and the media attention, that they also rely upon healthy and well-trained workers that often manage risks in their lives over the course of their journey through welfare state institutions. I would argue that these companies rely on the welfare state just as much as government and not-for-profit organisations whose main goal is poverty alleviation. Unfortunately, when we think of the welfare state, all too often we think about programs such as unemployment insurance and similar controversial transfer payment systems. Yet this payment, at less than $20 billion in a typical pre-COVID federal budget, is not, I believe, an accurate reflection of what the flows of resources in the welfare state of a whole. The two biggest areas of expenditure of the welfare state by far are health and our retirement income system, putting all the components of each of those ecosystems together. Each of those are many times greater than unemployment and certain other payments that generate so much academic and public policy debate. Of course, those payments that I refer to are important and we need to design them well. But I feel at times the public policy debate and especially the economic literature is skewed away from where we actually devote our resources and where we have the biggest impact on people's lives. I believe that the welfare state has three key intellectual pillars. Firstly, the universal provision of services. Secondly, redistribution. And thirdly, insurance and risk management. Now, these are all important and often they're aligned, but they're not always aligned. And a lot of what I explore in the book is where we can achieve better results by putting a greater emphasis on risk management and insurance. I believe that it is instructive to think of the welfare state as largely a huge social insurance scheme, where we all pool our resources to help those in need when unexpected events, not through the fault of the people adversely affected, occur in their lives. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, I think, accurately reflects this sentiment when he describes the post-World War II US government as a vast insurance scheme that happens to employ an army. Framing the welfare state in this way, I believe, is useful for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think it more accurately reflects the flows of resources. And if I had death by PowerPoint, I could show you the breakdown of the Australian government and the US government, health and the retirement income system and other insurance-like schemes are far greater than, as I said before, some of the transfer schemes that generate so much public debate. I mean, as an aside, I think some of those transfer schemes would actually do better as genuine insurance schemes, but that's something I'll touch on later. Second, I think if we put the emphasis more on insurance and less on redistribution, I believe that we can get better outcomes. Often the redistribution debate portrays the welfare state as a series of transfers from rich to poor, but it very quickly gets us into a them and us debate. A class of people who are lifters and leaners, to borrow some of the terms in the Australian political vernacular. But in the US, it's the makers and the takers. In the UK, it's the strivers and the skivers. But for me, the vast bulk of welfare isn't like that. If you look at the health system, if you look at the retirement income system, it actually functions much more like an insurance scheme. Not only that, if we look at a whole range of longitudinal studies, both here with Hilda, in the United States with the PSID, but right across the world, the Productivity Commission undertook a report into this not long ago. Many of us spend our lives moving up and down the income and wealth deciles. Unfortunately, there is a class of people who are stuck at the bottom, and as I'll explain later, I think for them insurance is the right approach. But I believe insurance is the right approach also because the welfare state is not about lifters and leaners or makers and takers. The vast majority of us through our life, through the life cycle, through life events, find ourselves taking different benefits at various stages of our life cycle. And I believe insurance is the best way to think of that. I believe that when we think about unemployment, for example, so much of the academic literature in relation to unemployment ends up trying to model the mindset of an unemployed person as an equation where the length of benefits and the amount of benefits are two variables who dominate their thinking at the margin. And if we increase the benefits a little, they'll be more inclined to stay unemployed longer. If we increase the duration of unemployment, they'll be inclined to stay unemployed longer. Now, of course, moral hazard matters in the real world and incentives matter. As an economist, I don't want to suggest that those models have nothing interesting to say. But I believe, particularly when it comes to our long-term unemployed, the people who come into my office whose lives are stuck on a treadmill, the people who desperately want to work but can't see a way forward, those people need investment. Those people need a different approach. And whether the unemployment benefit was 5% higher or 5% lower, whether we slightly increase the benefit or punish them a bit more to make them work harder, whether we make them apply for 20 jobs a month, I believe that investment is a better approach. And investment flows, I believe, from an insurance mindset. I could take you through any number of academic models that, as I said, each capture something true about the unemployment system. But I believe more often than not, those models where people are making decisions at fine margins about benefit levels or about the matching in markets, how picky they are about jobs depending on how good a match they think they could get if they wait longer. I don't believe those models work well for our most disadvantaged people. In terms of the context of government, I won't go on at length, but I do think it's worth observing that risk has been with us forever. Even before modern governments, societies had to manage risk. So there was food sharing arrangements in agricultural societies, and historians have found quite sophisticated ways in which people shared food, which shouldn't be surprising given it was a matter of life and death. In Greek and Roman times, occupational organisations, much like the guilds, provided at times things that looked like modern unemployment insurance. And of course, private insurance emerged in the Middle Ages once a bunch of geniuses in Europe actually found out how to manage the ins and outs of probability. And then after John Graunt and Edmund Halley actually started collecting data, it was that combination of probability and data which actually allowed private insurance markets to evolve in life, in fire and other areas. But really it was all that little patchwork of somewhat ad hoc arrangements that the state then started to expand dramatically in the 1880s under Bismarck. He introduced a series of groundbreaking bills which all included the word insurance in the title. So insurance for loss of work, insurance for loss of income in retirement, insurance for poor health, insurance for disability. Again, we think we're reinventing everything whenever we expand a social program, but if you look back in those days, there was quite an expansive vision. Now, the difference between a lot of what Bismarck did and what we do today is that a lot of those arrangements weren't heavily subsidised, so they weren't as much a cost on the state, but the vision nonetheless was very much around risk management. Fast forward a couple of decades to FDR's response to the Great Depression, the core of the Second New Deal, and I believe one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of the United States, the Social Security Act, which implemented the Old Age Survivor and Disability Insurance Scheme. And it was really eerie in a lot of ways for me to read Roosevelt's rationale for the OASDI, which to this day remains by far the most effective anti-poverty mechanism in the United States. He talked about the fact that existing arrangements were underfunded and inefficient and sporadic. And I looked at that sentence and then I went back to the Productivity Commission report into the NDIS, and it was almost the same sentence with slightly different adjectives. So for me, the welfare state has been about taking existing risk management arrangements and broadening them and making them more coherent and comprehensive. In Australia, we were early adopters. We mandated participation in a number of schemes around the turn of the century. State governments implemented old age pension schemes. In 1908, of course, we had Deakin introduce the old age pension, which I think was legislated by Fisher. And in the 20s and 30s, the climate wars of the time were really about social insurance, where everybody was agreed on the need for national social insurance, but the Conservative side wanted it to be funded by risk-rated contributions, and the Labor Party wanted it to be funded by progressive taxes. But going back to that time, we were ahead of the Beveridge report in the UK, for example, and a lot of other developments in Western Europe. And then, of course, there was Beveridge, who was absolutely groundbreaking and so influential globally. As an economist, I think it's worth noting that many of the welfare institutions that have the most impact on our lives are structured around the core regulatory interventions that economists suggest for private insurance markets that are struggling or that break down. So mandating participation, subsidising participation, or limiting the extent to which insurers can vary premiums across different classes of people. These actually go to the heart of what a lot of our welfare state is all about. And it was interesting for me that historical studies of US legislators found that when they were making speeches in the case for the expansion of the welfare state, they were referring to the concepts that economists use to fix broken down private insurance markets, even if they widely eschewed all the jargon. I believe that now is a time when we need to reimagine the welfare state. As I mentioned earlier, we have $1 trillion in debt. We have a welfare state that is a very significant proportion of GDP. We have cost pressures in the very largest schemes in both our health system and our pension retirement system because of an ageing society and cost pressures across both of those schemes. And despite efforts by all sides of politics, the productivity challenge is not an easy one. We are in the midst of a sustained period of low productivity growth. So I believe that just as earlier governments, and in particular I point to the Curtin government in the middle of World War II, at a time when Australia was facing the threat of invasion, desperate and menacing uncertainty, they expanded the welfare state dramatically. And I believe that now is a similar time where we face different kinds of uncertainty, but where we need to rethink the welfare state. I just want to make a very brief tangential point that I think it's in doing that, it's worth making or observing what the role of government has been over the very long term. The size of government over most of human history, going back to the Sumerians and the Romans and ancient Chinese dynasties, was around 5 to 10% of GDP. Not always, but that was the typical size of government. And the first infrastructure that governments tended to involve themselves in was water infrastructure, obviously to make agriculture more efficient, but then roads. They obviously invested in administration. They obviously had to spend a bit of money to keep the palace well fed. And then there was the army. It really, right across history, I don't want to generalise too much, but a lot of the graphs that you see, it was only at times of major war where government as a share of GDP rose above 10% for extended periods of time. And what we see in the post-World War II period is that government expanded dramatically. So there, again, if I had death by PowerPoint, the UK has by far the best data from the pipe rolls and other data that's very high quality. If you look at the UK over the last 350 years, what I call Roman Empire government was pretty much all there was, up until around World War II, where the welfare state, in terms of not just mandating participation in insurance, but subsidising it, was then around 1 or 2% of GDP. But it was really after World War II that in the UK, in the US and in Australia, the size of government expanded dramatically, and it was largely social insurance that drove that. It was a very positive development in my view, but we also need to acknowledge I believe that it's unlikely that we're going to be able to go through another period where we can expand the size of government by a further 10 or 15 or 20% of GDP. So government might increase a bit as we age and as we experience cost pressures and as people expect the government to do more. But I believe it's going to be a different kind of step change than the one we experienced in the period 45 to 80. And the other interesting point I think to note is that at a very high level, and of course there's always a lot of change underneath the surface like the duck's feet churning away, but in most OECD countries, albeit at different levels, between 1980 and 2020, the size of government as a share of GDP across all levels hasn't moved a lot across most OECD countries. So that is something, again, that is important context, I believe, because the welfare state is now so big. I think we have to understand that broader context if we're to truly understand how we reform it. So what are some policy ideas? Well, firstly, I believe that moving to an insurance frame will help us focus on outcomes. Now, outcomes sound like an obvious thing, but as a public servant, I must say, I remember back in the Department of Finance, we had the inputs, outputs, outcomes framework and many other frameworks since. Outcomes are often extremely difficult to specify, let alone measure. It's extremely difficult to measure in the life of a person. If you're trying to have a long-term impact on that person, what was the impact of this particular social policy intervention? There are so many other things happening to them. We know that randomised trials are one way, but they're actually very difficult to implement in many contexts. So long-term outcomes, I believe, will be a much greater focus. In the commercial insurance sphere, the contract links the payment of a benefit to the payment of a premium and the promise of compensation to be paid in certain circumstances. Now, of course, we all know many situations where what the promise was can be debated after the fact. But that core agreement, in most situations, works well to specify the relationship. I believe that a well-designed social insurance scheme should activate investment from the massive communal pool that we build up to individuals that reflect each individual's needs and also their preferences. The social insurance scheme should also have a long-term frame. Sometimes payments that are based on a redistributive frame can be based on a person or a family's point in time position within the income or the wealth standing. But that doesn't often take into account a range of other factors such as the life cycle or such as their individual idiosyncratic needs. Further, institutions focused on universal service delivery can sometimes focus on outputs delivered within a short-term budget constraint. Now, in some contexts, that's appropriate. So vaccinating a large population, universal service delivery is the right frame. And there are others, access to GPs, I would argue probably childcare. But there are many areas, and I would argue particularly where we're dealing with our most complex, people with the most complex and long-lasting needs. For those people, the insurance frame is far better. It takes their needs out and determines what their individual needs are, what their individual preferences are, and it takes their funding away from short-term budget cycles. So that is absolutely imperative. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the New Zealand investment approach, where they've, through statistical analysis, through rigorous long-term analysis of which people end up costing the welfare state the most without any attempt to blame, but simply to understand where those costs arise. It turns out that investing in those people up front is highly likely to produce strong long-term outcomes for the state. Now, I believe markets can be a powerful tool for eliciting people's preferences. Of course, in Australia, we've been at the forefront of experimenting with markets in all sorts of areas, such as Job Network and Workforce Australia, such as aged care, in many other contexts. And many of these markets haven't functioned well. We find lots of situations where there are far too many providers, all gravitating towards a low quality outcome. So the competition doesn't provide what's needed for our most vulnerable people. We also find many situations where there are so many providers that it's impossible for the kinds of people who are receiving benefits to make any sense of what choices there are. And we know that many people opt for defaults no matter what information is put in front of them. Moreover, we know that many of the markets that we've set up have extremely complicated governance that often turns out to be ineffective. So we try and set up markets where we evaluate all of these various providers, but then we end up putting all of our effort into trying to deal with issues like cherry picking and fraud. But that isn't to say we should give up on markets, because well-designed markets can work. And one small example that I worked on when I was a state MP involved the provision of bus services to a school for students with autism in Melbourne. This was a school that had a bus service that was very much appreciated by parents. Students and parents greatly appreciated the service that was provided, but it is also true to say that there were many students who were travelling for more than 1.5 hours each way. It is also true to say that there were a number of students who would miss their first class or would arrive home exhausted and difficult to manage in terms of their bedtime routine. It's also true that the bus routes, which are so difficult to design, it seems counterintuitive, but designing bus routes is one of the most complicated transport challenges known to humanity. It's also true that many of the students had to change buses, which was incredibly stressful for them. So we brought in experts from Caltech, experts in optimising routes. We brought in experts from the University of Melbourne. We designed a competitive tender for optimised routes. We ended up with a solution where no student had to travel more than 1 hour each way, where there were no changes of buses, where the average student's travel time more than halved, and it was all for the same cost to government. So for me, this is just a small example of where we can use markets to better reflect people's preferences, because of course some parents wish their child to be picked up at home, but some didn't need that. And of course with an extended version of what I talked about, you could have flexibility as to when students are picked up, so some parents could have their child stay at school if they were working. It's a model that could be made more and more sophisticated. It's a model that I believe could be rolled out much more widely. It's a model that I believe could be rolled out in schools right across regional and outer suburban areas. It's a model I believe that could be used to provide transport to train stations for commuters. I believe it's just one example of the application of markets that could have very wide application. Navigators, I think, are absolutely critical. Many people have made this observation, but again, I think within an insurance framework where you take funding away from short-term cycles and make the decision to invest in our most vulnerable, we will get better outcomes in that area. And there are any number of areas within our current welfare state spending where there's already a lot of progress in that space. And finally, risk mitigation and risk shifting. So risk mitigation, I think it goes without saying, is in many contexts value for money. Not all contexts. The Congressional Budget Office in the United States did a very broad examination of schemes that spent money up front in a precautionary manner and found that many of them were value for money, but not all of them. So I certainly would say that you need business cases in those situations. But as they say, better to build a strong fence around the cliff than to park an ambulance in the valley. And finally, shifting risk. Shifting risk can be a game changer that doesn't bust the budget. HEX is an Australian innovation that I believe proves that point. It has expanded access to higher education in Australia and indeed around the world. And I think all of the studies that have compared HEX-type schemes to schemes such as the ones in the US where people are given access to loans or even subsidised loans, HEX provides much greater access, particularly for people who are disadvantaged and at a fraction of the administrative cost. I believe the same could be used with industry policy. I believe it is much better for government, particularly with very high risk projects, to co-invest and to think about managing and risk and de-risking projects rather than providing grants. That builds on the work of Mariana Mazzucato and others who would say that government's been doing that for decades, but often in ways that aren't recognised. And finally, I'll give another example from when I was in state parliament of shifting risk. There was a program for women's change rooms. It was providing about $14 million. It was a wonderful program, very much appreciated by clubs that received it. But at that time, and since I might say, the demand for girls and women's teams was going through the roof. It was partly as a result of the rise of the AFLW, but the $14 million didn't touch the sides. So what we ended up with was a huge number of clubs waiting endlessly for grants. So what we created was an additional scheme where, in addition to the grants, the government would set up arrangements where clubs who happened to be a bit better off than the very worst off clubs, and clubs that were building a community facility that might generate a little bit of money. So for example, if it had a cafe or if it had a function room that might be used by the community, they would be loaned money by the government at AAA rates. So the government was taking on some risk, but it was all very heavily vetted. Local governments were required to take a part in the process in program design and other aspects of the projects. And ultimately, we found that there was a huge demand from clubs for these very low interest loans, particularly given the partnerships were on offer. So this wasn't instead of grants, but it was an additional opportunity. And in the end, we were able to achieve more than 10-to-1 leverage in terms of how many projects we could support for a given amount of public expenditure. Now, yes, the government had to take on a little bit of debt, but in terms of some of the areas of investment in poor communities and in people who have very desperate needs, I believe that the amount of debt from such schemes in a whole range of areas, whether it be social housing or whether it be services for refugees, would be minuscule compared to our overarching debt, but the payoffs would be massive. And the final point is sustainability. I believe that an insurance frame is ultimately by far the best frame for thinking about whether we can actually keep our promises. So an insurance framework is really about saying, is the pool that we're setting up or is the long-term revenue stream that we're accumulating enough to pay for the long-term obligations that we're saying we will satisfy? And it's only through rigorous, actuarially based insurance schemes, I believe, that you get those answers. And if you look at a scheme like Sweden's pension scheme, they also ingeniously, I think, adjust at the margin so that there's intergenerational fairness, so that when demographic projections come in and turn out to be different to what was expected, adjustments are made at the margin so that each generation, both the current taxpayers paying a pay-as-you-go pension, but also the people receiving it, share some of the gain or the cost. So I think there's both a greater rigour and honesty in insurance schemes, but also the potential to share risk in a way that can be very beneficial. So I believe the welfare state is one of our crowning achievements. It arose from insurance schemes, and I believe was largely, not wholly, but largely motivated by risk management principles and by building on insurance schemes. By returning to those origins, I believe that we will be able to improve the outcomes for the most vulnerable in our society and to help preserve the public institutions that have served us so well.
So many thanks to Daniel Mulino. As I said, they're copies of his book, Safety First, The Future of Welfare in Australia, and we're selling them tonight and then online later on, and I'm sure our speaker would be happy to sign a copy or copies. I should say thanks to Michael Tehan, one of our Melbourne members who drew attention to Daniel Mulino's book, to Dr. Mulino's book, and thanks to Michael. And so we come to questions and discussion. Oh, for those who just love, what did you call them, PowerPoint presentations. A lot of those graphs that might have been up on the wall are actually in the book. So you can find, if you're desperate, you can find them. There they are. So, okay, so we come to, now as you know, you've worked in the public service, you've worked in Victorian Parliament, you're now in the Federal Parliament, you've advised business, and you're talking about the welfare state. So what do you do in the practical terms when you go back to Canberra and Parliament sits again in a week or two time? And you've got this situation where you've got Australia is essentially a welfare state of sorts. You've got a huge number of people on unemployment benefit, and you've got a very low number of people who are unemployed. So what's your learning over a long period tell you about how you address that issue if people say, well, the welfare state's not working because people are on welfare, shouldn't be, in view of the current unemployment level, which is historically low. Sorry,
oh, no, well, thanks. I think you're packing a lot into that question, and so thanks for the question, Gerard. So look, first and foremost, I wouldn't say that the welfare state's not working well, because as I said, I think that there are huge parts of the welfare state which actually provide people with a safety net in ways that we take for granted, but it's worth remembering the ways in which which these institutions provide us that safety net. So the first point I'd make is that I think the welfare state is doing a very good job. So we have much less poverty in retirement than we would if we were using institutions, relying on people's personal saving, relying on more ad hoc arrangements, relying on guilds, whatever it might, occupational arrangements. If we were relying on pre-Great Depression arrangements, I believe there'd be many more people living in poverty. There are some, of course, but there's that. Look, I think our health system, you see in the papers every day about how much it costs, how much the costs are increasing. You know, you see ambulance ramping. So look, there are issues. But again, I think it's worth starting from the position of acknowledging how much it provides us. So I think it is actually providing us with amongst the best quality healthcare in the world. And again, as I said, I think that is a huge insurance scheme where rich and poor rich mostly put in, but rich and poor benefit. And I think that's the fundamental characteristic I think that sometimes is missed when we talk about other smaller parts of the welfare state. Now, when it comes to unemployment, look, I think you make a really strong point that there is a group of people who are receiving benefits. And we might ask, when unemployment's 3.5%, what's happening there? So my view is that, firstly, we've become a bit lazy, I think, in looking at unemployment statistics, comparing 3.5 now with 3.5 in the 1970s, when in the 1970s there was no underemployment, it was a much more male workforce, it was just a very different world. And so I think there are all sorts of barriers to people participating. I think even with 3.5% unemployment, there's something like 6.5 to 7 underemployment, and that varies a lot. I did work with Claire O'Neill in the previous term on this. So underemployment is now far greater than unemployment, but it was almost non-existent 40, 50 years ago. So there's that side of the labour market where I think there are actually a number of challenges. But secondly, I suppose my perspective on the labour market is that even before COVID, we know that a lot of the labour market programs, previous iterations of Job Network, Workforce Australia, they were paying more for workers who were identified as coming from a disadvantaged background, but we weren't getting the results there. So they might pay a certain amount for a person who really just needed their CV fixed up, and then the people who run those organisations would try and get them into jobs quickly. So this is the issue, some would say, of cherry picking, where a lot of firms will have a business model of going for those easy wins and not necessarily always getting them meaningful jobs. But I think even before COVID and the current strange economic situation we're in, we've for a long time had this problem where there's this long-term unemployed cohort that I think we've struggled to get into meaningful unemployment. And that's really where I think we need to think about an investment approach, a long-term approach for those people. And look, I see a lot of those people in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and so many of them come in with so many issues on top of the fact that they're long-term unemployed. And there are all sorts of new ways of approaching welfare overseas. It's impossible to cover all of them. That's why I think it's worth piloting a range of them over the next few years to see which work and which don't work. But I do believe that if you look at our labour market programs, it's that cohort that we're not serving well at the minute.
Question.
Thank you very much.
It's on, I think.
Is it?
Yes.
Is it? Oh, good. My first question would actually be to Gerard. I found that so full of information and raising so many questions that I've got about 80. So my first question would be, Gerard, could you arrange a sort of weekly seminar we could go to? One of the first, I mean, I've got a lot, but the first, I'm only going to ask one, Gerard, but my first question is, all of the examples you've given have been from what one would call Western or capitalist societies. And I'm wondering if you've looked at any apparently successful, left-wing socialist societies, and whether the same analyses or incentives or whatever you want to call it apply.
Look, it's a great question. And so one of the decisions I made early on was that the kind of macro focus of the book would be that I would really focus on Australia, the UK and the US. There are many ways in which you can think about all the various welfare states across the OECD. There's a very prominent frame which puts those three countries in what you might call the liberal class of welfare states. And so I thought it would be interesting to compare schemes that were different but also not too different. And what I've tried to do is to look at lessons learned from some of the countries you refer to in the case studies throughout. So the first part of the book is really saying, through data, like where has this welfare state come from? Like how big is it as a share of GDP? Which it's interesting. I actually think a lot of people talk about the welfare state without necessarily appreciating, how big it is across all three levels of government and how big government is across all three levels. But look, I think you are spot on. There is so much we can learn from welfare states in Western Europe and Northern Europe, and look, undoubtedly other places as well. So when it comes to aged care, for example, there's a number of schemes in Europe and even Japan that I point to as things that we might want to think about. There are many things we should be looking at in other countries.
Daniel, congratulations on the book. And
Right up to now.
Thanks.
This way.
okay.
Eat the ice cream.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Biddy. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And great that you're continuing that proud tradition of, I think, agitating in terms of good policy progress. So well done.
Hopefully not too agitated.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on how important, I guess, you talked about in that the historical origin of the insurance market data that actuarial approach with probabilities and so forth, how important in a public government context is getting more out of our own data and technology. It just sort of struck me as amazing in the middle of COVID when they were trying to hand out JobKeeper, there were people kind of queued around the block, but we all carry sort of computers in our pocket. And so not only can we not provide a good customer experience, but clearly we're not sort of harnessing that data to deliver some of those individual outcomes that you were talking about. Do you think we need, in addition to some of those big demographic changes that are changing the financial calculus, how important is it going to be to get that right, I guess, to start to make some impacts in terms of your recommendations?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I suppose, this has been one of my big obsessions / fascinations over recent years, and I think data is something we should be investing a lot more in. And again, just to go back to the labour market, for me, there's this matching opportunity that I think, again, I looked at a little bit when I was in state government. So Hazelwood shut down when I was the member for Eastern Victoria. And look, the government did a wonderful job, and the government provided counselling to people. But I'd just come back from an Australian-American leadership dialogue and met one of the founders of LinkedIn. And they've created this data pool, which is basically all of their members' qualifications, work history at a much more granular level than I suspect the ABS will have for a long time. But also everybody else's reflections on them. So, other people kind of come in and say whether you're good at data management or not, or whether you're good at leadership. Now, it's not perfect, but it's probably a lot better than what people say about themselves. So there's all of that. But then they also had all the firms and exactly what they wanted. And the granularity there was remarkable. So I tend to think about, do they want an engineer? But when I asked them to download Postcode 2000, it was down to the level of, in the top 5 skills, one of them was Java. So it was down to individual computer programs. When they showed me the data dump for Manchester City, it was TV camera operator, because they have one of the biggest concentrations of TV studios. And it just struck me, this is exactly what vet providers often say, that employers want very specific skills often. And quite often you'll have a person who will have 90% of what they want, but they need a short course in, say, camera operating or Java or whatever it might be. So it's always struck me that there are so many places where this could be done better. And Jobs and Skills Australia, I've been saying for the last few weeks, is for me a fantastic start, and we need to make sure that we get as much out of that as possible. Again, just one quick example in my old electorate, where we had a massive train stabling facility, which we knew was going to generate 200-300 jobs, some very high skilled, but many which could have been satisfied by the TAFE next door. And it was really just a matter of getting all that data between the two organisations, but also to kids in high schools in the area. Now, it sounds all easy and obvious, but it's just hard to do in practice. So the final thing I would say about greater data is that I actually also worry about private insurers now having more data about us than often we do. So in a lot of the early insurance models, it was called information asymmetry, because we knew more about the situation than the insurer did. So is the car a lemon or not? So they don't know you don't know what price to pay for the car, because you don't know whether it's a lemon. Only the person who owns it does. But now, interestingly, with flood insurance, for example, they know exactly what the water risk for properties is. So I suppose the good thing and the fair thing is that we're now unwinding all the cross subsidies that used to be there, where a whole lot of houses that didn't have any risk of flood were maybe paying a little bit for flood insurance they would never conceivably need, and making it a little more affordable for everyone else. As insurance companies get more and more data, they're going to unwind all that, which, as I said, is fair in one sense, but it's also going to create real affordability challenges. And I think at an even more profound level, like, what does that do in health insurance? Now, at the moment, we have all sorts of restrictions on the difference in premiums you can charge. And as I said, that's one of the fundamental recommendations economists make. But does that come under threat over time? I don't know, but these are real challenges.
Helen Trigger?
Daniel, thank you for that. 2 questions. It's a bit cheeky, really, but the first one is, your bus model, why do you think you haven't been able to get it across the rest of the state or the rest of the country? But the more serious question probably is, I think the government is, if I'm right, is doing a review into the whole employment providers issue. I read that just a few weeks ago. and I wondered what you thought.
Oh, do you mean Workforce Australia?
Yeah, Workforce Australia, etc. So they're actually doing a review into that entire model. What would you like to see come out of that?
Oh, so on the first question, look, I think it's just a matter of the difficulty of like running the pilot and then evaluating it and then figuring out like where do you run another tranche of pilots. You can't just expand it, from one school to the whole country. Each state has slightly different transport markets, but also, as you can imagine, I mean, different special schools have different cohorts of students with different needs. So I suspect where we're going to have to go with this is probably to run quite a few pilots and expand it over time. But I'm really hopeful on that one. And I don't think it's me breaching confidentiality to say that I'm on that inquiry. So I hope that's not the case. But in any case, just between us. But look, I'm going into it with an open mind. And as I've said, I feel as though there's a lot that works well with our welfare state. There's a lot that works well with unemployment benefits and the systems that are set up. But I do believe that we could do better. And so I think all of us are going to go into that inquiry.
Where's it likely to report?
I don't know.
The question was, when's the reporting? And it just wasn't picked up. You don't know. Gerard, do?
Yes, look, I'm not completely persuaded about the social insurance model as to what you're trying to get over, whether you're trying to sort of reframe the optics of welfare so that people come to understand that it's not primarily about redistribution, it's about, which I don't mind that at all, but I wonder if that's what you're trying. I'd just like you to develop that a little bit more, why you think it's so important to put this emphasis as you do. And when you talked about the low interest loans, for instance, I mean, that's a very, very interesting way you're thinking. Are you saying that could be a much better use of government money than straight grants? And I'm assuming you are, but also the optics of that. Who would have access to government capital, if you know what I mean? And so it just seems to me you're trying to reframe the look of welfare, is that right?
No, so look, I think it's much more than optics. I think it goes to the heart of if you think, and look, in some situations, redistribution is important. So I fundamentally believe we need to fund the welfare state largely through progressive taxes, or that needs to be a big chunk of it. But redistribution is actually quite tricky in practice because redistribution ends up coming back to a redistributive justice framework. And there's been debates for thousands of years around what is fair. Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equality of outcomes? There's the Rawlsian framework. So my concern is if that's when you start thinking in those terms, firstly, it gets you into that whole debate between redistributive justice frames, which is a really tricky and insoluble one. But secondly, I do think redistribution often lands you in a point in time discussion around if you rank families and individuals right now in terms of income and wealth, like where should resources go to achieve whatever redistributive justice measure you've landed on. And I just think, I don't mind using progressive taxes as the funding and we can debate at the margin as a society, how we want to tweak that over time. But I do think that it's a more constructive frame to say, if we look at health, if we look at retirement income systems, and indeed if we look at unemployment, particularly for those very vulnerable, what we end up doing, I think, when we're investing in people in a meaningful way is pooling resources and then not drawing those resources subject to short-term budget constraints. And that's really where I'm making the contrast with, in some context, universal service delivery, which often gets caught up in how many outputs can we pump out given a short-term budget constraint. So again, just to give one example, the ACC in New Zealand is like a huge accident insurance scheme. Now, there was a huge debate in New Zealand over whether it should be fully funded or not. And then this debate, I think it's fair to say, goes back to the 1970s, and they did fully fund it. But once you fully fund a scheme like that, they can then draw resources from an actuarially determined pool of money that individuals need to get the compensation that can get them back on their feet. Our transport accident schemes work that way. Our workers' compensation schemes generally work that way. You think about the NDIS, and again, it's not perfect, but what it's trying to do is to say there are these risks, some some at birth, some acquired. And what we're trying to do is to think through, like based on your individual needs, what resources is it going to take to get you to a place that reflects your preferences? So it might be some people want to focus on getting into the workforce. Some people want to focus on...
But aren't you really saying we could all be... I thought you were saying we could all be prone to this, therefore it's worth investing in it. That's what I thought you were trying to say.
Well, no, and I do think that an insurance frame, I think it better reflects the fact that when you look at particularly the very big social insurance arrangements like retirement income systems and like health, it's much less an us and them. And once you get into the redistributive thinking, again, you think about it in terms of we're redistributing from one group to another, but I actually don't think that's how it works. And so I think it's better because it's more accurate, but also, and perhaps more importantly, I think it's a pointer to how things should be structured to get better outcomes.
We're coming to the end, so we've got to be pretty brief. There's a quick question here. Well, I think there'll be a quick answer. It's from someone in Canberra. How would you suggest we set the level of welfare services to get people back to work?
Well, look, again, I think to me that goes back to that frame of thinking about it a bit too much in terms of some kind of equation where the benefit level at the margin is this swing factor, which is relevant for some people, but not all. And look, I think that if you look at the performance of employment programs here, but also in other countries, quite often there's, with a certain group of people, like a white collar, somebody with a lot of work experience, somebody who's perhaps lost a job but can probably get a job in that industry, like they need a very different kind of help than somebody who maybe has lost their job because a power plant closes and there's nothing like that in the town they live in, and they've got to make a choice about totally reskilling or moving. And that's extremely difficult if your house prices collapse or if you want to stay where your family and friends are. So I actually think we need to ask that question, but in different ways for different cohorts, and that's the fundamental point on that.
Okay, so we go there and then down there. See if we've got room here.
Dan, that is all very terrific and enlightening. But the question this redistribution idea is always going to be with us. Because if I pay for private health insurance, I'm paying for my insurance. But in say, the NDIS, unemployment benefits, people who are on welfare almost from the time they're born, they're never paying for any of their insurance. So you've got this problem of who pays. And however you go around it, you've got a problem of who pays. And right now, there is a diminishing number of workers paying tax, while there is an increasing number of people on benefits. And this is probably the problem with unemployment at the moment and getting people back to work. So how do you make those who we deliver to make some contribution in this notion of insurance?
Yeah, and again, one point I would make at the outset of answering that question is that if I had one of the slides up, which was Australia's government at all three levels, but the same applies for the US. So much of this debate, I think, focuses on unemployment recipients as this group that doesn't pay in, and then there's a group that is...
But I'm thinking of the NDIS particularly.
Right, well,
blowing out hugely.
So again, look, I think that's where I think it's really worth stepping back and looking at the size of all these schemes, because as I said, unemployment less than 20 generally. Now, with the NDIS, look, one of the core rationales, if you go back to the Productivity Commission report, was to increase workforce participation. And so, again, I really question the extent to which that journey is sufficiently being activated under the current scheme. So when I talk to people on the pre-poll line in Fraser, so what they say to me first and foremost is, look, NDIS is much better than what came before it. So they want to get that out there. But then they'll list a whole bunch of huge challenges. And I think one of the key ones is so many people want to get more satisfaction and fulfillment in life through that avenue, and then they, of course, would start contributing. And again, I was at a round table with members of the African community, both people with a disability and people who wanted work in the NDIS. And there are just huge barriers for both of them But so many people from the African community wanted to work in the NDIS, and so many people with a disability obviously wanted to as well. So look, I think workforce participation for me is something that is an inherent good. It gives people more dignity, more autonomy, more agency, but also from a macro perspective, it's a first order issue.
Okay, we're going to be very quick. There's one there and we've got time for this one here. Okay, speak into the microphone.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask a question specifically about the age pension, because if we regard it as like an insurance scheme, then the pension system in the United States is a lot more like an insurance system than the Australian one, because in the United States, the age pension is not being tested, which means people actually paying more tax. They get a fair bit of more pension than people paying less tax. But in Australia, basically, especially if you're paying very high tax, which means you have very high income, you basically almost not getting any pension at all. So I just want to give us a perspective on that two systems.
Yeah, so look, first and foremost, and that's why I picked a few, the US, UK and Australia, because even amongst those what's called liberal welfare states, we are quite unusual in that we means test many payments and we have flat payments. It's very different to even a lot of our other arrangements in the UK and the US. And a lot of that goes back to very early on. Look, when I think of the pension system, I go back to the World Bank report in 1994, which was actually crafted around the time that Keating was pushing a lot of revolutionary changes here. And what it really said is the best pension systems have a multi-pillar approach. So you have the state, which basically provides a basic income for people in retirement, and the state is in the best position to provide longevity and inflation insurance, because within a huge cohort, it can share that amongst everybody. Other arrangements like private accounts don't do anywhere near as well as that. But then you have mandated and private savings. And so the mandated savings help because what they help with is over time, if you have small cohorts coming through and huge cohorts retired, they will have at least saved a bit for themselves. So generally, the first pillar is what you call pay as you go. So generally it's current taxpayers paying for current retirees. So look, there is risk management in each of those pillars. And so again, I go back to the pension system, and I think a well-designed pension system has to manage risk. It has to manage the individual risks around longevity, around prices, around investment returns. But then we also need to have macro settings in place, and superannuation is ingenious there. The only final point I'd make about the pension system, and this actually applies more broadly, in the US, there's some progressivity in the system where you generally pay a certain proportion of your income and then you get a proportion out the other end, but it's capped at a certain amount. So high income earners are in a sense paying more than they get back. But the interesting thing is they live longer. And so Martin Feldstein basically worked out all the pros and cons and worked out it's probably kind of on balance. And there's a whole bunch of people in the US who have done studies of their Medicare system, which is basically the system for old age earners. And again, rich people put in far more for that. But what they find is that rich people also access all the high cost procedures, both because they know about them, they can organise their lives to access them. So what they found again there was rich people are putting more in, but it turns out that it's actually not that progressive in practice. But going back to your original point, look, I think risk management is absolutely central to any well-designed retirement system.
Not a question, it's got to be brief and answer.
Your presentation seemed to, firstly, congratulations on your book. Your presentation seemed to focus more on individuals, households, or the community. Just wondering whether your book also covers the welfare state in terms of its support for corporates, businesses, and industry more generally, because we've seen, obviously in the last decade, we've seen through the GFC, bailouts, cash flow payments, equity stakes that governments take, a whole range of different things that government sort of does to prop up various industries, whether it's banking, airlines, manufacturing, the like. Just wondered whether you've got a view about that and whether there are some instruments that are more effective compared to others.
So very quickly on that one, look, my predisposition, I'm an economist, is that I'd want a pretty clear case of market failure for government to step in where it's helping corporates. Look, as I said earlier, I do think perhaps investing in early stage research, perhaps co-investing in very high risk innovative projects. But look, in general, I'm probably a bit less sympathetic on that front than in investing in young kids who need a job in Sydney and Melbourne's West. But look, I'm not closed off to it. And then there, as you say, there are all sorts of schemes that benefit corporations. But as I said, I also think that what the welfare state does for the emerging workforce with health and education benefits them massively too.
Many thanks. So I'll be very brief. Many thanks to Daniel Mulino for a very penetrating and thoughtful address to the Sydney Institute. All the best with the Safety Net, the Future of Welfare in Australia. Their books for sale both here tonight and then later on online. But for tonight, thank you, and we'll have you back sometime in the future. Well done.
Thanks.